Päivää, että pätkähti. Kuuntelet Kaikki uusiksi podcastia ja minun nimeni on Toivo Haimi. KU:n päätoimittaja Jussi Virkkunen on tällä nimenomaisella hetkellä muissa tehtävissä, joten häntä ei tässä jaksossa kuulla. Siitä huolimatta ette tälläkään kertaa pääse kuuntelemaan minun monologiani, vaan meillä on aivan erityinen jakso tiedossa kahdellakin tapaa. Ensinnäkin minulla on täällä studiossa vieraana Nick Walters, yksi Helsinki Leftin eli vasemmistoliiton englanninkielisen puolueosaston perustajista. Nickin kanssa me keskustellaan paitsi lähestyvistä kuntavaaleista, myös maahanmuuttajien osallistumisesta suomalaiseen politiikkaan. Ja toiseksi vaihdamme näiden alkuhöpinöiden jälkeen kielen englanniksi, mutta koska kuuntelijamme ovat kielitaitoista sakkia, tämä tuskin on kenellekään ongelma. Welcome to the show, co-founder of Helsinki Left, Nick Walters.
Thank you, it's great to be here.
Wonderful to have you. Nick is standing as a candidate in the Finnish local elections that will take place on April 13th this year. In this episode, we'll talk about the elections, but also about politics in general and the ways that Nick and Helsinki Left have encouraged and facilitated immigrant participation in politics. Right, so Nick, you're a candidate in Helsinki for the local elections this spring. Let's start with a quick and easy question. Why and how did you first get involved in Finnish politics?
Well, I got involved because I've been trying to find a way to be somewhat active in the party, but it was really difficult because even though people were really welcoming with the language issue, not being a fluent Finnish speaker, they didn't really know what to do with me, and other people also had the same issue. So eventually, after several years of thinking about it, we decided to create our own space in the party. One thing I've learned is the party has quite limited resources. So if you want to make something happen, you really have to just make it happen.
Right.
And, yeah.
So you just have to do things.
Yes, exactly.
Yeah. Well, the interesting question for everyone I have on the show is what shaped your worldview and your politics? Because what I like to know is why are you a lefty rather than being on the right? Because for me it was the Iraq War, the global war on terror, and most importantly the financial crash of 2008 that pushed me to the left. Have you had any similar turning points or worldview shaping events in your life?
Yeah, well, I'd say that I grew up in a very conservative area and politics wasn't really spoken about much in my family at all. And it was really when I moved to Sweden and did my master's there for a couple of years that I started following the British news much more closely because I was away from home. I wanted to be in contact with what was happening there. And then I started to see...
So this was early 2010s? Or?
Yeah, it was about then, actually, yeah. I started to see how much better a society could be organised. I also met my Finnish ex when I lived there and got to know Finland a bit as well. And the Conservatives shortly after took power in 2010. And I started to think about more and more how much better society can be if we have a better kind of politics.
Right.
And so there wasn't like one radical moment that changed my perception, but it was very gradual over a long period and with lots of discussions with friends and things.
What were the aspects of Swedish or Nordic society in general that really shook you? Like, it's strange we don't have this in the UK.
I didn't know that much about Swedish politics when I was living there, but it was more just the sense that most people, of course it's not everyone, but a lot of people living quite comfortably and having access to the services they need. And of course there are many issues in Swedish politics, and especially nowadays, and the way that immigration has been weaponized by the far right there, just like it is here. A little bit lagging behind here, of course.
Yeah.
But generally, I felt like people have a decent quality of life, whereas in the UK, a lot of people are living in poverty. And I think that's not really recognised on an international scale, quite how bad things are in the UK.
Exactly. And one of the things that sets the UK apart from other European countries is that it's still a very class-based society, meaning that where you're from, what do your parents do for a living, what your parents' education is, it really defines the path your life will take in the UK. And a bit of patriotic pride here. We don't have that as much in the Nordics or Finland in particular. Do you agree with me, or am I completely wrong with this one?
Yeah, I do very much agree with you. I think it's sometimes a little bit overstated how in the Nordic countries it doesn't have an effect, because of course the education system has been quite good and that offers people opportunities regardless of their background. But I mean, the education system's getting degraded in both Sweden and Finland.
And in the UK.
And in the UK, of course. But I mean, it's not as perfect here as many like to believe. There's a lot of room for improvement. And there is a class system here. If you go to Stockman, for example, you see a totally different type of person than if you go to Kontula.
Exactly.
So there is a class system. It's not as deeply rooted, and it has, I mean, it's not like in the UK, where you come from really matters a lot.
Yeah, and social mobility, which used to be the pride of Nordic societies and Finland in particular, meaning that anyone could become anything they wanted. Social mobility has slowed down in our lifetimes for the past 15 years, and that's a really worrying sign of a return to a class-based society.
Yeah, totally.
Which should be prevented.
And in the UK, I saw a video the other day. I don't know how like fact-based it is, but it seemed to be quite genuine based on statistics, that in the early 70s was the peak of social mobility. In the post-war recovery, there were many opportunities to move on the social ladder in the UK, and I think maybe the US as well.
Yeah.
Whereas since then it's just gone backwards, basically.
It was the end of the Trente Glorieuses, as the French put it. But enough of that. Let's talk about your campaign for a seat on the Helsinki City Council. As said, you're standing as a candidate here in Helsinki for the Left Alliance. What are the key issues of your campaign for a seat on the council? What's your campaign about, and what policies would you like to see implemented in Helsinki?
Yeah, so there's three main areas. The first one is about social inclusion. So that's about eradicating discrimination. I'm already a deputy member of the Equality and Non-Discrimination Commission of the city, and I'd like to go further with that work. The next theme is about public services, so protecting public services against privatization and austerity. Already many of the public services in Helsinki and in Finland in general are subcontracted out to private companies if they're not done in-house. And so I'd like to advocate for reversing that trend, because it doesn't provide good quality services, and it's maybe cheap decision in the short term, but it's a very expensive decision in the long term as we pay the profit of those companies. And the other theme is protecting Helsinki's nature. So the one specific thing I'd like to do is, together with the party, we've agreed that in Helsinki we're going to advocate for making English an official service language. I believe that others have attempted this in the past, maybe led by the Green Party, but I think that now, at least 4 years later or so, there's a lot more cross-party support for this. What it means is not degrading Finnish or Swedish as a language, as national languages of the country, and not giving English equal status, but rather that all services have to be provided in English. And I know that already in Swedish that's not being met, even though it's legally binding. So
try getting any service in Swedish in Kuopio or in Kajaani. Won't be easy.
Even in Helsinki and Espoo, you'd be surprised that some people can't get all of the services they want, including immigrants who have chosen to integrate in Swedish.
Really?
Yeah.
Well, that's a surprise. So let's talk about public services, because the thing that irritates me a lot when talking to right-wing people is that they have this argument that they repeat day in, day out, that public services are inefficient, that the private sector is more efficient, it can provide better services at a lower cost, and I just don't see it, because if you have someone making a profit in a service sector that should provide affordable quality services for all, let's say healthcare or education or public transport, cutting out the middleman, meaning the private company, would enable us to use the resources to provide the service instead of ballooning the profits of the owners of the private enterprises. So have you had this similar discussions with right-wing people, and how do you answer?
Yeah, well, I totally agree with you on your point. I've definitely engaged in those discussions in the past, but they don't come up as much here as maybe they do in the UK.
All right.
But yeah, they do come up sometimes. I've had this conversation recently with when I was campaigning on the streets, handing out flyers, and I don't know, I feel like maybe the person I spoke to who upfront told me they're more on the right maybe started to see a bit of truth in what I was saying, but I don't know.
Right.
But I agree with the point, because let's just be totally honest, centralization of everything by the state does not inherently lead to a better service. It can lead to all kinds of corruption and everything. But private companies inherently make a profit or aim to make a profit on their services, which means that they're either charging more for the service or they're paying their staff less. And neither of those things is sustainable. And there are some companies that can do it in a less exploitative way and some that can do it in a more sustainable way. But I think that we should be aiming to run most of our public services in-house. And it may be that there's like a very specific medical test that's just not practical to do that publicly organized by the city itself, and where it's worth paying for a private service. But I think we should again be maybe favouring smaller companies and not corporations in that case.
Yeah, and we should, as a society, be very mindful about what do we spend public funds on? Do we spend them on public services, or do we facilitate a company making a profit?
Yeah.
Now, Finnish local politics can be quite complicated and inaccessible, even for Finns who speak Finnish or Swedish as a first language. What's your take on the accessibility of Finnish politics, or lack thereof?
Yeah, it's definitely a tricky thing for an immigrant, and even the news is not very well covered in English, just because there's a lack of resources. I mean, there's lack of funding for Yle, for example, and
even more so now.
Exactly, and then English is not their priority, so there is some good journalism in English in Finland, but it's hard to get detailed news about what's happening, especially on a local level, because it's mostly on a national level what is reported in English. And then, of course, when you're interested in politics and being a politician, then you also have to understand legal language, and that's very difficult.
Yeah.
But luckily I've gained some experience over the last couple of years being a shop steward or a trade union representative, and being involved in the council of my trade union as well, and also on this non-discrimination commission. So I start to understand the language a lot better. I can follow the discussion. It's very hard still to speak about politics in any level of detail in Finnish, but I'm totally capable of understanding it and doing the work, and there are good tools for that as well.
Great. Friedrich Nietzsche once wrote that when battling monsters, one should be mindful that not to become a monster themselves. And the longer you gaze into the abyss gazes back into you. Have you had the same effect? The more you learn the legal language and the political language of Finland, the more it absorbs you, and you start to regurgitate that language to anyone you talk to.
Hopefully not, but I do have to bring up the non-discrimination and the Equality Acts quite often when people are treading over those boundaries that protect our freedoms. So yeah, I do sometimes refer to those laws. But Yeah.
Right. I've seen from your social media that you've been quite busy handing out leaflets and talking to people, for example, in the Hakaniemi Market Square, campaigning. What's been your experience of campaigning in the local elections this far? What do people want to talk to you about when they come to talk to you?
Yeah, it's been really positive so far. People are really engaged with the campaign, and I think one of the most interesting things is seeing immigrants when they don't know that they're eligible to vote, and then finding out and being really surprised and very enthusiastic, because people are very proud to be able to participate in elections and in democracy. And really high number of immigrants are unaware that they're eligible to vote in these elections.
That's quite a surprise because, as far as I know, everyone gets an actual paper letter delivered to them, telling them that they're eligible to vote and where their polling station is.
I believe these days it's mostly through suomi.fi.
Really?
But
well, that's digitalization for you.
Yeah, and then it's much easier to ignore it. Or if the language is an issue and it's coming through the door in Finnish and Swedish, and you just don't bother to read it. And then there's also different attitudes towards elections among immigrant groups. Some come from places where there is no democracy and they don't have any faith in democracy, even though they may realize it's better here. But they just don't think voting makes a difference. Yeah. And that's quite sad because their rights are the most under attack.
Yeah, and it creates this cycle of underrepresentation or non-representation because there are regions in Helsinki where no deputies to the city council are elected. So those areas become unrepresented in the decision making of the city. So when there's when the city council is discussing, for example, what schools or daycare centres to shut down, those people who are reliant on those services don't get their voice. They just can't get their voice heard because there's no one to represent them, and that in turn encourages cynicism and disappointment in politics in general and in the political process. So they vote even less. So that diminishes their voice even less. So we have this vicious circle. Do you see it the same way?
Yeah, it's very, very true. And as a Brit who is used to a two-party system, I've been extremely proud of Finland's proportional representation system. But I've had a couple of discussions lately with Lee Andersson and Mia Haglund that were very interesting and revealing to me about the De Hond method with the open party list system. It's not actually the most perfect system. Yeah. And the reason is that we could have positive discrimination, which in other areas of life, such as in representation on company boards, has led to a huge improvement in representation of women and people of colour, for example. And the open list system means, I mean, on paper, it looks like the most democratic system. Yeah. But it also means that you can't positively discriminate and get people elected who do come from an immigrant background. Yeah. But also within nationally, it's very positive that you have large constituencies in which multiple MPs are elected. But on a local level, you just have the entire city. And that means exactly what you said, that maybe the power is concentrated in the wealthier areas anyway, just naturally, because more people have a comfortable life, they have more time free maybe, and they're more likely to stand
and more cash to campaign.
More cash, because the average last election in Helsinki was 8,000, the cost of a successful campaign. That's a lot of money. Not many people in Left Alliance have that kind of money.
Exactly. And I've heard people say that the city council municipal elections don't matter. Well, if they don't matter, explain me this. Why do people put 8,000 euros of their own hard-earned cash in order to get to that power?
Yeah, and that's just the average. So, I mean, in our party, it's probably a lot lower.
Yeah.
I know Elina Kauppila had just like 2,400 or something last time with a successful campaign. So then
that's still a median net wage for a white-collar worker.
For sure, and then people on the right are maybe putting in double what the average is.
Yes, exactly. Let's continue with Helsinki Left and the work you've done to facilitate immigrant participation in politics in Finland. A couple of years ago, you co-founded Helsinki Left, the English language party chapter of the Left Alliance. How did Helsinki Left come into being?
Yeah, so as I mentioned earlier, I'd become aware of a few other immigrants who had trouble getting involved in the party, even though they were fairly proactive and they wanted to be involved. And 4 years ago, during the last municipal elections, I was campaigning for another candidate and started to think about running this year. And I reached out online in some Facebook groups of the party to see if other immigrants were having similar issues. And then I got chatting with Melissa, and we talked about the possibility, we actually explored it a little bit with the party as well, of founding an English language chapter. I mean, I was interested in founding something on a national level. For example, there's the women's part of the party, and there's the youth wing, but they're actually organized in a different way. And to do that for an English language level thing on a national level, it would have had to be passed by the party congress, which only happens every 3 years.
Yeah.
So we talked also about having a local chapter in Helsinki, but I felt like it would be a better aim to aim for a national level. But then after the government or after the election results in 2023, we started to consider this again, and we started to organize some informal events together with Melissa. We soon after met Dietmar and a group of other people who became our board members. And in July 2 years ago, we founded the chapter and started accepting members in September. And between September and now, September a year and a half ago, and now we've got over 130 members, which is quite a strong number. There's definitely a huge demand for this. But we're also not limited to Helsinki. So even though we have Helsinki in our name and we're under the Helsinki district, you just need to have a permanent address in Finland, and we have members across the country.
Lovely. That's really nice to hear, because Finland is not unlike other Western European countries in the sense that party membership is in decline throughout the board, from left to right. Fewer people are members of any political parties now than, say, 40 years ago or 50 years ago. I think the peak was in the early 80s when party membership was at its peak. So what do you think drives people to Helsinki Left? What's the main motivator?
I think the language is the main issue, because we make politics accessible to people who don't speak fluent Finnish or Swedish. And we also have quite a lot of Finnish members and even Swedish-speaking members, because we're also one of the most active chapters, I would say. So we have events every month, sometimes a couple of events each month, and we're keeping our members engaged and the wider public. So I think the thing that attracts us is the accessibility of Finnish politics.
Great. Why did you decide that it was necessary to have a specific English language party chapter instead of people with migrant backgrounds just joining their regular party chapters in Mellunmäki or in Kallio and so on?
Purely based on experience, that although people are very welcoming in those chapters, they don't really know how to utilize your skills if the language is already a barrier.
Yeah.
So that would be my ideal situation, is that we wouldn't be dividing people by language, but the reality is it makes it much easier for us to get stuff done and become involved. And there's a Swedish language chapter that's very long standing, and there's a reason for that. And there's also a reason for having an English language chapter.
Right. Now, A bit earlier, we talked about the problem of underrepresentation and non-representation in Finnish politics. That is an issue, a regional issue, say here in Helsinki. But people with immigrant backgrounds are severely underrepresented in Finnish politics and decision making. They are less likely to stand as candidates for elections, less likely to get elected should they stand, and even less likely to vote at all. I think I saw a figure that in the last municipal elections, 26% of the non-Finnish or Swedish or Sami-speaking people who were eligible to vote in the elections actually did vote. So 74% of those eligible to vote just didn't bother. Yeah. So what consequences does this have for society, and what can be done to reverse this trend?
Well, I think that if we start from the lack of voting, that comes from a lack of knowledge, a lack of trust in politics and in authority, and just a general lack of belief that it leads to positive change. And there's a lot of reason to be cynical about politics because there are a lot of cynical politicians. Yeah. But as we discussed, this means that if those voices are not being heard, then other voices are being heard more, and those voices are often anti-immigrant, or at least in some cases. And in other cases, they're not directly anti-immigrant, but those parties are willing to work with the anti-immigrant party. So it's a form of self-harm, unfortunately. And then if we go to the next level, which is why don't people stand as candidates? Well, I think the main thing is that not all immigrants speak one of the two main languages fluently. So that's a big barrier. And even that lack of awareness that they can vote extends to lack of awareness that they have the same right to be a candidate if they can vote. Finally, the last level, why are fewer of them elected? Well, I think that is maybe because there are some certain attitudes towards immigrants in Finnish society. It's one of the most racist societies in Europe. And even though in Helsinki, I would say that's like the attitudes towards immigrants are much more positive than maybe in some rural areas where there are very few immigrants, but there's a big suspicion of them. That is still reflected in the numbers, I would say. Yeah.
You talked about cynicism and a mistrust of politics in general, and I can really see that because I'm 35 years old, and in my lifetime, I've seen very little improvement in society that was accomplished through politics. What politics has offered to society in my lifetime has been austerity, cuts to public services, tax breaks for the rich, and socialism for the wealthy and capitalism for the rest of us. So I don't dissociate myself from anyone who says they can't trust politicians or politics, because what politics has done for many people, not only in Finland, but everywhere across Europe and the Western world in general, so to speak, has been the experience that politics doesn't represent me. Politics can't change my life for the better. Any change that politics can bring to people is for the worse. So what do you say to people who have this experience, which is not that uncommon?
I think it's totally understandable that they feel that way, but then the question is, what other means are there to make society better? There, of course, are many other means, and grassroots activism is one of the most important means. And trade unions, for example, whose membership is also in steep decline. Yeah. And just a word of warning, in the UK, I think the membership of trade unions is below 25%. And in Finland, it's been about 90%, and now it's down to 80 or even 70. Yeah. And that might also be a little bit, unfortunately, due to migration, because many immigrants are not a member of a trade union for similar reasons to why they're not engaged in politics, is because they might not know about it. They may not think it's worth the money because immigrants typically are on a lower salary.
Yeah.
So then it's a bigger proportion of their salary to become a member of a union. They may be scared about being associated with a union because in their home country, it could be a reason for them to be targeted for some kind of repercussions. There are many reasons why immigrants aren't members of unions as well. So I got sidetracked there.
Yeah, but none of those reasons are pretty convincing. Are convincing for me. If you work, if a person has a job and that workplace is organized, there are only good reasons.
Absolutely,
to join the union.
I'm active in my union, so I'm encouraging people to become a member and become active as well. But back to the issue of why people are cynical. Yeah, I understand why they're cynical, but then we need more people elected from the parties who are best representing them and most challenging austerity and privatization and other kinds of policies. And the only way to do that is if people vote.
Yeah. What's the most important thing or the most interesting thing you've learned in your political organizing with Helsinki Left?
I would say that I've gained a lot of people management skills, which I hadn't quite realized would be a big part of the work, is managing different kinds of relationships. Yeah. I've learned a lot about the challenges that immigrants face and tried to support them in many ways. And then another thing is what I said earlier, that if you want to make something happen in politics or activism, then you really just have to go out there and make it happen and bring the right people together to make it happen, because it doesn't happen by itself.
That is true. Before we finish up, I have one final question. The local elections in Finland are a month away. What issues do you think haven't been discussed enough in the lead up to the elections? And are there some issues that you'd like to see discussed more?
Yeah, there's one thing that I think would be really interesting to see more discussion about, and that is municipal tax becoming progressive. I've really heard very little, if anything, about this topic, and it's something that, since I've seen the positive effects of having a more progressive taxation system, I've always wondered why municipal tax is not part of that, and also corporate tax. I believe, even though it's not a municipal issue, I believe corporate tax should be progressive, because then that would support small businesses and make it harder for them to become really exploitative, massive corporations. Back to the municipal issue, it discriminates against the lowest earners. And again, this maybe affects immigrants a bit more because they tend to be lower earners. And I think we could solve a lot of issues by making the taxation a bit more progressive.
Great. So if you encounter Nick or any other candidate for the local elections, feel free to talk to them about progressive municipal taxation. Thanks very much for this conversation, Nick, and best of luck with the election next month.
Thanks for having me.
Tässä oli tämänkertainen Kaikki uusiksi podcast. Kiitos, että kuuntelit. Muistathan myös tilata meidät sieltä, mistä podcastisi saatkaan. Jos tämä keskustelu herätti sinussa ajatuksia, emootioita tai affekteja, niin kerro niistä meille. Meidät löytää helpoiten Instagramista @kansanuutiset. Voit myös lähettää postikortin osoitteeseen Hämeentie 105A 00550 Helsinki. Kaikki uusiksi podcastia tuottaa Kansanuutiset eli Kusari eli KU, joka on todella hyvä lehti. KU ilmestyy verkossa joka päivä ja painettuna lehtenä kerran kuussa. Tuet tätä podcastia, tilaa Kansanuutiset, tee se saman tien osoitteessa ku.fi. Mun nimeni on Toivo Haimi, mun kanssa keskusteli Nick Walters. Ensi kertaan, morjentes!